morrow, good listeners, and welcome to the Shakespeare podcast with me, Koel Chatterjee. This month, we're exploring the larger field of Shakespeare and graphic novel adaptations, where high culture and low art collide. We all think we know William Shakespeare. He's the foundation of the English speaking canon, the genius whose words define tragedy, romance, and history. But what happens when you take the definitive highbrow text, the soliloquy, the iambic pentameter, the Elizabethan stage, and smash it headlong into a medium traditionally dismissed as juvenile, the comic book, or the graphic novel if you're a grown up? The result, I think, is not just a simpler version of Macbeth or Hamlet. It is a radical act of reinterpretation. The graphic novel doesn't just adapt Shakespeare, it transforms him. It creates an entirely new mythology, forcing us to reconsider the very nature of authorship, fidelity, and justice in the modern world. Since this is the first episode on this monthly theme, today I'll attempt to unpack this cultural collision by exploring three fundamental themes that define Shakespearean graphic narratives. First, formal translation, the challenge of turning language into pure visual rhetoric. Second, cultural interrogation, how comics force an ethical reckoning with historical prejudice. And third, mythological expansion, where Shakespeare's characters literally escape their fate and turn the bard himself into a character. The primary challenge for any direct graphic novel adaptation of Shakespeare is translation, not just from early modern English, but from the stage to the page. Shakespeare's plays are fundamentally verbal and performative. The graphic novel is visual and sequential. So, how do you translate a powerful soliloquy, a moment of profound internal thought, into panels and speech balloons? On the stage, the soliloquy, like those in Hamlet, is a deliberate stage convention, signaling to the audience that the words are consequential and revealing the profound psychological depth of the character. In the graphic novel, this interiority must be drawn. It can be rendered through traditional thought balloons, but the medium's unique capability allows for far more sophisticated visual metaphor. Consider Hamlet's internal conflict, described by some as a split personality, moving between warm poetic sensitivity and cruel madness. The graphic novel doesn't need an actor to act the madness. The artist can draw it. The panel borders can fracture. The colors can shift to convey psychological chaos, or the character's form can distort, literally externalizing a descent into paranoia or despair. In the Black Dog's graphic Shakespeare library adaptation of King Lear, the illustrator Ian Pollock used a shaky, twitchy, scribbly art style deemed perfect for the play, demonstrating how the artistic form itself can embody the protagonist's emotional state. If you follow me on TikTok or Insta, I'll put up some examples of bleeding panels, shaky, scribbly, twitchy art that demonstrates how the artist or the illustrator can use this form. This focus on visual translation is inextricably linked to the debate over fidelity to the text. Publishers are constantly navigating the commercial imperative of accessibility against the academic demand for linguistic authenticity. You find adaptations neatly stratified in the marketplace. On one end are versions aiming for strict linguistic adherence, such as the classical comic series, which released Macbeth and King Lear using the original text, though the, though the dialogue is out of necessity heavily cut. On the other end are products like SparkNote's No Fear Shakespeare graphic novels or specialized high-low editions which prioritize modern, accessible English. These are reading solutions often marketed to overcome linguistic barriers for students. This strategic split reveals that fidelity is not a singular loyalty to the source. It's a constellation of choices: loyalty to the plot, loyalty to the emotional truth, or loyalty to the historical aesthetic. When a team of adapters and illustrators decide the kind of story they wish to tell, and why, they engage in a process defined by multiple involuntary and indeed unconscious investments in different textual layers. Finally, the study of Shakespearean comics reveals a surprising historical precedent for this form. Scholars have noted a striking similarity between modern sequential art and a common visual verbal print form of Shakespeare's own time, the emblem book. An emblem book combined a motto, a picture, and a poem to convey a moral or philosophical point, and was very popular in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. Emblem books descended from medieval bestiaries that explained the importance of animals, proverbs, and fables. In fact, writers often drew inspiration from Greek and Roman sources, such as Aesop's fables and Plutarch's lives. I'll put up some pictures of emblem books that I found on Insta later today. This structure of reading words and pictures together is the very raison d'etre of the comic book. This accidental or organic connection suggests that the graphic novel isn't just a modern translation tool. It's a continuation of an early modern, visually literate mode of literary engagement. When Shakespeare, the symbol of high culture, meets comics, historically relegated to low culture, the collision becomes a politically charged commentary on the literary canon itself. The act of pairing them compels an equal conversation between the great works and marginalized forms. The mass proliferation of accessible graphic adaptations, from Othello to The Tempest, democratizes the reading experience, moving the bard from the rarefied academy into the popular visual marketplace. Crucially, the medium's inherent visual nature compels creators to take an ethical stand on the issues of race, religion, and gender. On stage, certain character descriptions can be subtle or left to interpretation, but in a graphic novel, the illustrator must visually define the characters. Take the graphic representations of Shylock from The Merchant of Venice and Othello. Since Othello has long been codified as a race play, The adapter must make an explicit choice about the protagonist's ethnicity and complexion, a choice that frames the entire narrative around interracial dynamics. Similarly, drawing Shylock requires a conscious decision to either lean into historical, often anti Semitic visual tropes, or actively resist them. The visual fixity of the comic page serves as a crucial ethical filter, determining whether the adaptation is a progressive engagement with difference or a simple reinforcement of cultural prejudice. Some of my colleagues, such as Sarah Olive Jowett and Wendy Lennon, have discussed some of the problems that take place when illustrators do, in fact, decide to continue racist or anti Semitic tropes in their visual representations of these characters, especially when these graphic novel adaptations are mainly marketed to children to make Shakespeare accessible. This theme extends to figures of marginalization as well, like Caliban in The Tempest. Often seen as a post colonial play, or acted as such, it is usual to see Caliban described or acted as a monster. Artistic interpretations of Caliban vary from reptilian to bestial or simply deformed. In a Shakespeare story, The Tempest, for instance, Andrew Matthews and Tony Ross have illustrated a toad like creature to represent Caliban, which I think is quite problematic. The theme of corrective adaptation, on the other hand, is perhaps most visible in the reimagining of female roles, as is seen in many novelized and stage appropriations of Shakespeare in recent times. Narratives of appropriation are, of course, fertile ground for empowering women who were traditionally victimized or considered secondary. For instance, many adaptations in novels focus squarely on the witches of Macbeth, offering their perspective and motivations rather than simply treating them as external catalysts. I will introduce one of my favorite graphic novel adaptations of Macbeth in a later episode this month, Toil and Trouble by Meg Reed Scott, which tells the story of Macbeth from the perspective of the three witches, specifically the three fates of Scotland: Riata, Kate, and Smyrte. But the true liberation is found in narratives that grant post canonical agency. The comic series Romeo vs. Juliet, a Kill Shakespeare adventure, for instance, takes the ultimate victim of Shakespearean tragedy, Juliet Capulet, and allows her to survive the tragic ending. She is reinvented as an independent warrior for hire in a shared Shakespearean Western setting. Her survival, which includes a complex pregnancy subplot, uses radical genre fusion as a tool for exploring female empowerment, suggesting that these characters can rewrite their own tragic destinies. This brings us to the most radical category, the appropriation narratives. These are the graphic novels that treat Shakespeare not as an author, but as a foundational mythological figure, essentially creating a Shakespeare verse. In this shared universe, like the one established in the Kill Shakespeare franchise, characters from distinct plays coexist, often pitted against each other in a grand epic adventure. Here, the heroes, such as Hamlet, Juliet, Othello, and Falstaff, are marshalled against the greatest villains: Richard III, Lady Macbeth, and Iago. The core thematic function of the Shakespeare verse is to explore character agency versus textual fate. By removing figures like Juliet from the narrative constraints of their original plays, the new story asks whether a literary archetype can rebel against its creator and rewrite its own destiny. This unified intertextual mythology proves that the Shakespearean figures are not intellectual property, locked to one text, but enduring archetypes that belong to a collective, ongoing narrative tradition. The flexibility of these archetypes is confirmed through radical genre hybridization. These graphic novels successfully transplant Shakespearean conflict into utterly foreign settings, proving their universality. Prince of Cats, for example, focuses on Tybalt from Romeo and Juliet, but sets the action in a Blade Runner-esque version of Brooklyn during the 1980s. To seal the deal, the text is written entirely in iambic pentameter. The successful fusion of formalized Renaissance poetic rhythm with the code of honor of an urban samurai narrative validates the notion that the core dramatic structures, revenge, ambition, and doomed love, are timeless narrative blueprints. If you're interested in a podcast about book reviews or reading suggestions, by the way, you might want to check out my Shakespeare fiction podcast, linked in the show notes. This month, I'll be talking about The Prince of Cats and giving reading, listening, and viewing suggestions to help you get into the spirit of this adaptation. The ultimate meta-narrative theme, however, arrives when William Shakespeare himself is fictionalized as a character. The Kill Shakespeare series casts the bard not as a historical figure, but as a reclusive wizard who is the actual target of the hero's quest. This literally frames the author as a kind of demiurge, a magical source of power and destiny against whom his own creations must rebel to find freedom. But perhaps the most profound exploration comes from Neil Gaiman's celebrated Sandman comic series. In this story, the character Dream commissions two plays from a young, struggling William Shakespeare, granting him access to the greatest stories never told. The issue centers on the premiere of the play before an actual audience of fairy, including Oberon and Titania. By depicting Shakespeare as dependent on an immortal entity for his inspiration, a kind of Faustian bargain for genius, the narrative deconstructs the myth of the lone, perfect artistic genius. It suggests that stories are fundamentally borrowed, intertextual, and belong to a wider continuum. I have discussed this thread of autobiographical Shakespeare narratives in the fantasy tradition in my episode in Spirits of Another Sort, Shakespeare in Gaiman and Hoyt. The graphic novel, thus, is far more than a pedagogical shortcut to Shakespeare, as it is sometimes described by parents and teachers. It is a sophisticated artistic medium that has profoundly engaged with the canon. Through formal translation, it finds visual rhetoric to express psychological depth and connects our modern visual language back to the early modern emblem book. Through cultural interrogation, it compels an ethical reassessment of characters and politics, offering corrective narratives on race, gender, and social marginalization. And through mythological expansion, it liberates the characters, creating a shared universe where the bard himself is just another figure in the grand drama. By transforming Shakespeare into sequential art, the graphic novel proves that his work is not a stagnant historical monument, but a living, adaptable mythology that continues to shape and reflect our most urgent conversations. That's all for this episode of the Shakespeare podcast. If you'd like to fall into the academic rabbit hole on this topic, I'd recommend Shakespeare Comics, Art, Time and Character by Sven Arv Mikkelbost, and Shakespearean Comics, Negotiating Cultural Value, edited by Jim Casey and Brandon Christopher to start with. For more suggestions on which comic book Shakespeare you should try next, stick with me through the next few episodes this month. I'll be back next week to discuss manga Shakespeare and Osamu Tezuka's Shakespeare Manga Theatre. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider rating, reviewing, and sharing my podcast with fellow Shakespeare enthusiasts and nerds and academics. And do send me your ideas about what theme to cover next in Shakespeare. If you have any thoughts about the episode formats, or if you'd like me to add fewer academic materials or indeed more nerdy facts, do let me know. Email me at shakespop@gmail.com or find me on Insta, TikTok, Facebook, Blue Sky, and Threads and say hi. I hope you enjoyed listening to me as much as I've enjoyed talking to you.